Hey, everybody, and welcome to the Tech Founder Show. It's Tony Zayas, joined by Andy Halko. And on this show, we dive into some really interesting cutting-edge technologies that are out there and hear the stories from founders who are doing amazing things in this space. So, Andy, how you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic. How are you, Tony?
Awesome. Yeah, doing well.
I'm excited for today's show. Another great tech founder. We've had some really interesting conversations the last couple of weeks, and I think this one will be great too.
For sure. So without further ado, we have Bray, who's the founder of Phylum, and Phylum helps you uncover what's lurking in your software's dependencies. So we'll talk all about that stuff, malware, backdoors, all that kind of stuff. Let me bring Aaron on and we can jump right in. So, hey, Aaron.
Great to meet you.
Thanks for taking the time to join. And we'd love to hear what you guys are doing over at Phylum. Would love to hear about the business just to get started, what you guys do, and kind of go from there.
Absolutely. So great question. I guess the best way to sort of summarize that and kind of speak to what it is that we do and what makes us different and unique is we look at essentially we shifted the conversation away from what most companies in this sort of DevSecOps space specifically centered around package component analysis. Most of them essentially focus on giving you back a software bill of materials and a list of vulnerabilities and commercial license viability issues that exist in the packages you're using from the open source world. And while those things are certainly very important from both a legal and risk compliance perspective, we go much further than that. We really dig deep and analyze the entire software supply chain. So we analyze, information about the authors themselves, the source code inside of the packages, and we dig deep to hunt for effectively threat actors and malicious code in the dependencies that are being used by organizations large and small.
Very interesting. Yeah, I was just going to ask, Aaron, what's the origin story? Where did the idea come for Phylum, and how did you guys start the business?
Great question. So one of my co-founders, Lewis, and I did some consulting on a contract a couple years back. And the organization we were working with was really trying to get a good understanding of what their software supply chain looked like. And, while we were working on that project, we found that there really weren't any products that really spoke to the issue, at scale in the commercial space. There were a lot of products that talked about software supply chain security and, giving you insight into the open source you're using. But for the most part, those products kind of fell flat when we actually dug under the hood and looked at what they were doing. And so fast forward a few years, we've seen just a pretty dramatic shift in the landscape of open source and third-party packages and how they're being used in the wild. So, the ecosystems themselves have grown massive. So if we look at JavaScript, which is one of the dozens of these ecosystems, it's gone from about 12,500 packages 6 years ago to about 1.5 million today. And it continues to grow at a rate of about 1,000 net new packages every day. And really the consequence of this is now there's more packages being pulled into projects than ever before. And there's more effectively anonymous authors that are contributing code that's being pulled in and used in these projects. And really, it's all untrusted. And there have been just a steep increase in major incidents and security issues, like people inserting malware, backdoors, crypto miners, and what have you over the last couple of years. So we figured that the market was right for a product like this, and we launched last year.
Very cool.
Yeah, so just for those out there that may not be familiar, just to help maybe package this, and you can help me as well. But if you're building an application, you're going out there and finding a lot of different pieces of software that you're bringing in, what you're calling packages, and it's really making sure that the people that wrote that software were legitimate, the code's legitimate, there's not risk of security in these other pieces. And it's really, like you said, that supply chain piece of, software, which I don't think people think of very often.
Absolutely. And I mean, just to sort of quantify this, we looked at React at the very beginning of this just to see how bad the issue was for a specific piece of software. And what we found was that if you take and download all of the dependencies for React and all of those dependencies, and the dependencies of those dependencies, because every package you import has packages that it depends on, and those packages in turn have additional packages they depend on, you end up with something like 7,000 pieces of software that end up coming along with React. And the really interesting consequence of this is you don't actually get all 7,000 of those packages at once. You get different sets of those 7,000 depending on what other packages you have installed locally.
So I'm kind of curious to dive into what for someone that's building an application, what's the real world risk? Like what, are there scenarios that you can describe that have happened at organizations that are not paying attention to, where their packages are coming from and what's being wrapped into them and how they were built, et cetera?
Absolutely. So over the last couple of years, there've been a ton of packages that have been taken down every year for exhibiting essentially malicious behavior. So a few good examples of that are Event Stream, which happened maybe 2 or 3 years ago. It was a very popular package in the JavaScript world. It was upstream from a lot of major projects. And effectively what happened is an account compromise of one of the maintainers led to some malicious code that would steal cryptocurrency being inserted upstream from some of those major packages. And so all of the developers essentially who were using that package and packages it depended on, or that depended on it for software development, were effectively compromised. There are also about, a good chunk, I'd say, normally probably 1,000 to 2,000 packages a year, but just in the last month we saw about 5,000 packages get taken offline across a couple different ecosystems for doing this. There are a lot of attackers that will exploit something called typo squatting, where they'll take a popular package that's used by a lot of people across a pretty broad spread of code bases. And what they'll do is they'll take this popular package, make a copy of it, and add a little something extra. It might be malware, it might be a backdoor. They might just re-upload it with a very similar name. So they might, we've seen them transposing characters, or just name it something very similar that would be confusing to a developer, or something that a developer may inadvertently download by just accidentally typing the name wrong. And what will happen is they'll start getting hundreds to thousands of downloads a week with this package after re-uploading it, because there's just such a large volume of people building software and pulling out packages that a few of them will inadvertently grab the wrong one.
And I remember hearing a story a couple years ago about a developer that just became unhappy with the community and pulled their package, and it completely affected millions of different software applications out there.
Absolutely. There have been actually 2 or 3 incidents of that.
Now, is there, for a scenario like that, is there a way that you're looking at, constantly kind of monitoring and making sure that people, not just know the background, but, see what's coming?
Absolutely. So what we essentially do is, instead of looking at just vulnerabilities and license issues, we've split the risk that we consider more broadly into about 5 different domains. So we look at, vulnerabilities, license issues, so those are certainly a component of the supply chain and the risk it represents. But we also look at authors and author reputations. And so some of that might be, does this package only have a single maintainer? And if that maintainer gets mad, they might pull it offline, just as you mentioned. Or there have been at least a couple cases we've observed over the last few months where a major package only had one maintainer, and that maintainer went to jail. And so then the package is now effectively abandoned in place. We also consider things like malicious code, as I mentioned before. So we have some heuristics and machine learning models that help us identify those sort of typo squatter packages that I mentioned earlier, as well as some other situations like, malware droppers and things that have historically, patterns of behavior that malware has historically exhibited. And we also examine the risk that the authors themselves bring. So, does it appear that an author's account has been compromised, for example, based on their commit behavior and deviations from that normal behavior, and some other factors that we also take into account.
So this definitely isn't a manual process. You've developed, like you said, kind of machine learning AI
Absolutely.
that really, takes signals from these pieces.
Absolutely. And a lot of that really boils down to the fact that the ecosystem has grown so large and continues to evolve so rapidly that there's really no way to manually police it anymore. Even if you manage to go and validate every package in the entire ecosystem, which now there's tens to hundreds of millions if you count for all of the different versions of every package, then you still, you've already lost the game as soon as you finish that audit, because a number of those packages have already updated.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious with the machine learning always, how people, how do you start that in a product like this? Where do you start to build it? Because I think a lot of people think about like AI and machine learning, it's a big topic. And I've actually talked with a number of founders. It's like, okay, when you're starting at zero and you don't have anything, how do you start building a machine learning, solution with no data in a lot of cases?
Great question. So one of the great things is we actually have some data in this case. There's, at least a few academic articles that have been published over the last few years that have curated essentially some samples, large sample data sets of previous malicious packages discovered in the open source ecosystem. The other thing I think that maybe makes our solution a little bit unique is we've taken a slightly different approach from most of the other products in this space, in that we're not so interested in trying to give you a thumbs up, thumbs down about the risks that are in your software supply chain, but rather give you sort of a score by looking for effectively outliers and things of that nature. Which, if you think about machine learning broadly, there's generally two models of building such models, right? There's supervised models, which you have to sort of train and tell them, this is A and this is B and this is C, right? And you have to have a labeled data set. There's also unsupervised learning, which typically allows you to do things like identify outliers. And so we're more focused on the latter, although there are certainly some cases where we're doing the former. And there are other things that we're doing that really aren't machine learning in the traditional sense. We're taking and tying together a collection of models and heuristics based on past bad behavior or insights we've gathered by looking at the broad data set of the entire software ecosystem effectively, to be able to weigh in on things that look like they may be malicious or bad.
Aaron, I'd be curious to hear, obviously, you and others that are out there advancing technology to prevent this, the malicious packages that are out there and the bad actors. What on the other side do you guys see happening? Because I feel like it's a cat and mouse game that, you're always catching up to them. But do you see, what those malicious packages are looking like? Is that getting more advanced?
Great
what
question.
does that look like, and how do you combat it? It seems like a pretty crazy challenge.
Great question. So I think that is a very valid point. It'll always be a cat and mouse game between the people who are building defensive tech and the people who are trying to break into user systems. I think, though, that at this stage, the people who are playing in this realm, there effectively hasn't been much automation in this space relative to, say, the endpoint world, where you have a lot of tech based around like EDR solutions, cloud analysis, and sort of similar components. And so one of the things that that we're really focused on is taking a lot of those sort of lessons learned from the endpoint and desktop world to this new frontier of packages in the software supply chain. And interestingly enough, there are some significant advantages that we have by sort of playing in this space, versus that one where all you're really looking at is an opaque binary. You have a single snapshot in time of functionality, and you have to try and reason about very quickly, whether or not this thing is good or bad, or what its intent might be, and that's a very difficult problem. But in our case, we have not only access to all of the source code, and author information and everything else, but we have the entire, in most cases, the entire development history from beginning to end for all of the packages we're looking at. And so we can make a lot more inferences about, how things have changed over time and what its intent might have been, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So how'd you guys go from, an idea to a product? What was the process of kind of ideating and then creating and then even getting into, finding customers?
Great question. So I and both of my co-founders have spent collectively a long time working in the security space. I've been in this space for probably about 15 years now in various capacities. My co-founder Lewis, who I mentioned before, and I sort of started out on the federal government side, spent quite a few years there. I ended up working with my other co-founder, Pete, who kind of came up on the commercial security research and consulting side at another startup that I worked at a couple years back. And really, at the very beginning, when we first kind of got this idea and got exposed to the problem space, we weren't really sure if the market was right for it. But as we sort of saw the shift in patterns of behavior, how people were using open source, and the overall increase in number of attacks and issues in the open source ecosystem, and I guess all things related more broadly to software supply chain, we sort of figured the time was right to launch. And so we went and raised money, spent quite a bit of time putting together all of the market data and information necessary to do that. And we built out a team, and here we are.
So you raised money before you had a product, or did you already have kind of a beta or starter product?
We had a small POC.
Okay. That's good. How about from a customer perspective, how did you get those first clients and customers on board?
Great question. So a lot of those at this stage have come essentially through organic connections, either within the founding team or through our investors. And what we're working to do now is really bring the product to market and essentially broaden the scope of the folks we're interfacing with, and who we're able to reach and get in front of.
I'm kind of curious to talk a little bit about open source. I years ago when I was building my company, I taught myself how to program in like PHP and Python and some of these other languages. And I remember, 15 years ago, everybody wanted .NET because they were afraid of open source. How have you seen the open source world evolve? I see today that it feels like at the enterprise level, it's a much more comfortable conversation and expected. But I'd love to hear how you kind of view the world of open source as it's evolved and how it stands today.
That's a great question, and you're absolutely right. Even a couple of years ago, it was a much different story, right? And it's funny you mentioned PHP. It actually had its own supply chain attack a couple days ago. Someone actually backdoored PHP proper, maybe within the last 2 weeks. But over the last few years, organizations have really broadly began adopting open source and have become, as you mentioned, much more comfortable with it. I think I saw a survey that Synopsys did last year, and they found that across all market verticals, everyone is using open source, or at least all of the ones they examined for their survey. And in fact, all of the code bases they looked at were comprised primarily of open source. So they found that something like 70% on average of most of these projects were comprised of open source software, with the minority of that being code that was written in-house.
Why do you think that's evolved and changed? What do you think's gotten these enterprises more comfortable with that world?
I think it's probably two factors. So one is better understanding the risks of using it, at least in theory. So as I mentioned before, the landscape has shifted a lot in the last few years because the ecosystems have grown so much and more people have been adopting open source. But prior to that, the ecosystems were relatively small and easy to reason about. And once people sort of got over the license compliance hurdle, it became a lot more palatable to use open source. And, once we got a step past that, it's just such an accelerant over trying to develop everything in-house. Modern software projects are so complex that, almost nothing is built from whole cloth, so to speak, today.
Right.
And, this is sort of the logical outgrowth of a lot of trends that started even back in the 90s with, reusable code and encapsulation.
I'm kind of curious how many companies you think today are either at risk or using packages that probably have some sort of compromise or malware or something built into them. What do you kind of see as like the state of what your product solves? Like how many people are living with issues right now?
So far in our examination, almost everyone is living with some number of issues. And if they're not living with issues today, there were issues in the not very distant past.
Mm.
And, even more than that, effectively everyone is now at risk because, even by including a popular package or, any package really that's non-trivial in size and functionality, you're effectively giving indirect commit access to thousands or tens of thousands in many cases of upstream authors to your code base.
So how do you take that message, Aaron? Because, obviously you can inject a lot of fear there. That probably works for marketing. How do you communicate that to your target audience and let them know that there's this legitimate threat that is there or will be there, shortly downstream? How do you paint that picture?
Well, fortunately for us and unfortunately for the world and the rest of the community, the news cycle has actually been doing a pretty good job of that over the last few months. Obviously SolarWinds, we don't know if that was related to open source or not, but it's a very similar attack to the type of things that we would observe through an open source vector, where something like a build server could get compromised. And so, between things like that, Twilio's SDK got backdoored just last year. And, as I mentioned, PHP itself got backdoored maybe like a week or two ago. And there have just been a number of other pretty major incidents, even if we look back the last 2 to 3 months. So, now things are sort of coming to a head and people are starting to pay a lot more attention to this space.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I was just thinking your best marketing is just to stand outside a company with a placard that says there's malware in your code. Because everybody's got it. So, how are you guys, growing the company? What's your go-to-market? How are you trying to reach people and scale?
Great question. So today we're focused, our offering is sort of limited in terms of the audience we're targeting, as we sort of mature the product and get ready for more of a general launch. Over the next few months, we're going to be rolling out a more general release. And at that time, we're going to be trying to get our product and components of our product in front of a much broader audience, especially the technical implementers. So, developers, security engineers, DevOps and SRE type personas, the people that are actually, building DevSecOps and AppSec programs and, making sure that their code is secure and robust. And, given that we're also really examining, I don't want to call it technical debt, but the engineering risk that a lot of these packages bring to the table. So, how often does their API change over time? What does the test coverage look like? Things of that nature that certainly, software developers and people that are implementing solutions will care a great deal about.
What does the team look like right now, Aaron?
So we are about, I believe we are about 13 plus a couple contractors right now.
Great.
And what's your role within the organization?
So I am the CEO.
Okay.
So right now, I and my co-founder Pete are mostly focused on things like strategy, product, business development, sales. And we're pretty engineering heavy right now, but a lot of that is a consequence of our product just being rather complex.
Yeah. Now, are you involved in the engineering process, or do you still really stay at that higher level of those things that you just mentioned?
Great question. So I help out a little here and there, but I've mostly removed myself a bit from that. One thing that I've observed in other companies over time is that it's usually harmful to some degree if you have somebody who's sitting in like a CEO or president type role that's also trying to hack on the product, because you end up inadvertently, in some cases, speaking with a disproportionately loud voice when it comes to things like design decisions and similar related attributes as the product develops and matures.
That's certainly, a smart observation and move probably on your part. But was that hard to do, to remove yourself from that?
It was a bit at first. I mean, it was obviously a significant paradigm shift, but it's one of those things that I think was for the better. It also becomes difficult as we've gone from a very small team to a not quite a small team, because now my time gets monopolized by a lot of other things, and it's very difficult. It actually causes, I think, more harm than benefit if you have somebody who's trying to contribute in a technical fashion that puts in a little time and then gets pulled off for a week, and puts in a little time and gets pulled off for a week, because then now you create essentially roadblocks for other developers and folks in the organization.
Yeah, I think a lot of technical founders have a hard time moving away from, continuing to be in that technical role moving forward. So it's good that you were able to identify that early on and kind of, adjust things, but I'm sure it's still a challenge. How about on the product planning side? How do you guys as a team talk about, what is the roadmap? And I think one of the biggest challenges that I tend to see when I talk to people in the technical space is there's a lot of directions we can go and there's a lot of great ideas, but we can only do so much at one time. So how do you guys kind of work through your product roadmap?
Great question. So I think there are a few different factors that influence that. One of those is, we work to try and get our product in front of customers as quickly as possible. And one of the reasons for that, to establish essentially design partner relationships across a pretty broad spectrum of different market verticals, use cases, and CI/CD setups, was one of the big challenges from an AppSec product perspective. Is that there's not really a gold standard of what an AppSec program looks like. There's probably thousands, if not tens of thousands, of different combinations of existing products, solutions, workflows. Some organizations have like an open source governance organization where they have a few security engineers that are actually responsible for handling what open source gets used in the organization. Mm-hmm. There are others that have very limited or rudimentary systems where they may include some of the output of scanning tools in like a pull request or merge request, so that it's just part of the code review process. And there's essentially everything in between. And one of the really interesting things about this is it doesn't even really seem to be strongly correlated with organization size. It's really more about AppSec program maturity. And so one of our goals was just to make sure that we were as flexible as we needed to be to fit into as broad of a spectrum of use cases as possible.
Now, is that so? That's purposeful. Some companies try and narrow down and really say, okay, well, we're going to be a great solution for this. So you're really thinking that you want to be able to, work with a wide range of products that are in different life cycle or scenarios.
Now, I guess I'll caveat this by saying that I don't think there's really a silver bullet here. Every type of product is going to have a different sort of appeal, and there's going to be different trade-offs from the engineering perspective in terms of whether it makes more sense to go wide or to go narrow. In some cases, products might require a lot of tailoring in order to fit, a narrow use case. And so you might be leaving a lot on the table by trying to go really wide. In our case, though, interestingly enough, that really doesn't seem to be the case so far. We designed our product for flexibility. So we started out with a very automation-friendly command line tool. We're in the process of rolling out a UI that speaks more to the, economic purchaser of the product. So like the CISO, AppSec director, CIO. And so, effectively the consequence of that is it sort of fits into any scenario. And we just want to make sure that, we have good use cases for all of those things. And the insights we provide back are useful and meaningful, if that makes sense.
Yeah. What's been one of the most challenging parts of building this product? Has there been something that was like a big roadblock or something that you and your team really have had to spend a lot of time figuring out how to, get over that hurdle?
Great question. So I think the answer to that really is it requires a very broad spectrum of skill sets to really execute on effectively. And, that's because we're dealing in something that, is very centered around security, static analysis, but also more broadly, statistical modeling and big data analysis, data management, data engineering. And, so I think that's probably the biggest challenge, is just making sure that we can fill all of the roles and, that cut across the spectrum of things that we need to be concerned with.
Yeah, makes sense.
I've been very fortunate in my career to have, a nice collection of people that I could call on at the very beginning when we were at launch, and we've had a few folks come on since that have been extraordinarily talented that have, really helped get us to where we're at and where we'll be in the coming months.
Now, Aaron, did you say that there's 2 other co-founders?
Yes, there are.
So what is that relationship like amongst the 3 of you, and kind of how do you guys balance responsibilities and things?
Great question. So Lewis, who I mentioned before, he's extraordinarily technical, and so he's sort of taken over as CTO. And so he is essentially managing the engineering efforts and, product development as we go on. Pete, my other co-founder, of course, has a lot more commercial and enterprise sales experience. So he's more focused on, sort of that role. And, he's also extraordinarily technical. So he's able to help out a lot on bridging the gap effectively between the customers and the product roadmap and development. So, helping them out in terms of gap fill and essentially being a stand-in head of product almost.
I'm really interested in having, someone like you on and where your product is just understanding the landscape and where it's going in the future. So, I'd say bucketing that kind of open source and security within applications. What do you think the next 2 to 3 years looks like from a standpoint of how those things are going to change, how they're going to impact the market, the growth in, either risk or use. And so both for that open source as well as, again, more of this application security. What are you predicting?
Great question. So we've seen a pretty dramatic shift already just over the last year with the pandemic and, the increase in focus on application and cloud security. There's been a lot more spend in this space, even over the last year, and it seems like that's going to continue to grow into the future. As far as how our product is likely to evolve, we're sort of starting out in this, open source analysis realm, but really our goal is to then grow effectively into customer spaces and be able to provide what essentially amounts to the full spectrum of supply chain security. So, we can also take those same insights, the same analysis that we're applying on the open source side, and also apply that internally. I think that will give us a tremendous advantage as we, are able to not only perform static analysis of the graph of software that's being pulled in. We'll also be able to take and trace that line effectively from within customer code all the way to the edge of the graph.
And do you plan to stay focused on code, or would it get into infrastructure and other aspects of, the space?
Great question. I think to some degree that the infrastructure pieces, especially things like containers, are almost a logical outgrowth of what we're doing today, because they're very similar in nature to the things that we're doing in packages. They have, they're hierarchical, so often you'll have one container layer inherit from others. They have the same collection of maintainers, and frankly, a lot of the same concerns. I think it was just a few months ago that a bunch of Docker images were taken offline because they contain crypto miners.
Yeah, what are other really interesting scenarios that you've seen in this space? I find these stories interesting, but are there? You've mentioned already probably 3 or 4, but what other really kind of big things that folks that are out there may not have heard of or even should be aware of? These are the type of threats that are out there.
Great question. So, even beyond the scope of just vulnerabilities, at least in the traditional sense, we've seen a lot of attacks that have been almost targeted at I won't call them flaws, but things that are sort of related to design decisions around the package managers themselves. So there was a pretty major event in the news just I think it was maybe within the last month to 2 months. But a dependency confusion was something that popped up not too long ago. And essentially a security researcher was able to find a way to get their code to run inside of the networks of some really big tech companies. So, Apple and Microsoft and a few others, and they were able to collect several $100,000 in bug bounties by executing this. And it was sort of an interesting flaw, essentially. They found that essentially they were able to take and identify private packages by looking at open source software from some of these big companies or references on websites or things of that nature. And they were able to publish a package that had the same name as this internal package, but there was no external public equivalent of. And they were able to bump the version number up until they started getting downloads and installations. And so effectively, they were able to get their code to run inside of Apple or Microsoft's networks by exploiting this. And certainly that's not a vulnerability in the traditional sense. It's sort of an artifact of how dependency resolution happens.
Right.
Another great example is something called repo jacking that popped up within the last few months as well. Somebody discovered that a lot of package managers will allow you to link directly to version control system servers. So, instead of having a regular package that's hosted in a place like PyPy, RubyGems, or NPM, you actually have a package that is simply a Git repo on, let's say, GitHub. Now, what somebody discovered was effectively that over time, many of these will become abandoned. So the author might delete their account, or they might move the package someplace else. And so what will happen is there will basically be what amounts to a stale pointer there. So you'll have a file someplace that references this Git repository that no longer exists. And so what they found was that if they went and then created an account with that name and then created a package with the expected name, then they were able to now effectively provide whatever they wanted. And the package manager that was going and resolving dependencies would just go and blindly pull down the code that they put in that new GitHub repo that they created.
How much responsibility do you think, the groups like Bitbucket and GitHub and some of these other organizations should have in being responsible for the security side and understanding this? Or, is that where products like yours and, they're doing what they do and you people also really need a product like yours?
Great question. I think the answer to that really is, it seems like it would be complicated for them to police this because, there are obviously some countries that actually have right to be forgotten laws. And so if you have a right to be forgotten law, then it seems like it would be difficult to say, you're no longer allowed to delete your GitHub account. But if you just delete your GitHub account, then there's no real way for somebody like GitHub to know that, there are stale pointers still out there for some of these packages, because, they're frankly not the information owner of all of that data. So, many of these language ecosystems are, might be hosted separately. The package itself might be hosted on GitLab or Bitbucket or someplace else. And so, there's not really a good way for a centralized repository like GitHub to police this in a meaningful way, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of where. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that's sort of where a product like ours essentially stands in.
Yeah, and I mean that's part of the ecosystem, is you have these tools that are doing that, but obviously bring something like yours in. You had mentioned what bug bounty. I'm curious, does your methodology or machine learning or system think around the idea of kind of almost white hat measures for detecting these things, of like trying to go out and infiltrate to find what the issues are?
Absolutely, and certainly that's a long-term goal of ours. In the next few months, we're actually looking to roll out an API that will allow customers, and potentially, if we open it up a bit for things like bug bounties, individual contributors to go and potentially find bigger issues in the open source ecosystem.
So do you think that there is eventually like a community aspect to the product where folks are, helping your machine learning platform, like you said, almost previously, helping train that?
Absolutely. Yeah, there are certainly almost a million different directions that we could go in terms of what insights we could look at, and what things we could try and gather, and what information we could provide back. And I think really opening the aperture more is only going to be beneficial to the broader community at large.
That's great.
So for the rest of 2021 here, Aaron, what is in store for Phylum? Like, what are the plans and the goals that you guys have?
Great question. So we're planning a more general release in the next few months, and part of that is likely going to include our API rollout, as mentioned. So that's kind of the big highlights. We're looking at essentially broadening the product's appeal, and improving the catalog of heuristics and models that we currently have to date. So I think that's a big chunk of what the rest of this year will look like.
Very cool.
Yeah. I'm kind of interested in hearing, how you expect you're a very technical product, but you mentioned selling this CISO and some of these other roles, which they tend to be a little bit technical, but for other founders that are out there that they're technical, their product is very technical, how do you see articulating and talking to the marketplace? Do you try and dumb it down for those that are maybe in the business side of things and don't quite understand all the aspects of packages? Or have you tried to stay really technical to make sure that those folks that know what you're talking about know that you know what you're talking about?
Great question. I think there's definitely a careful balance there, because you want to make sure that people do know what you're talking about, and that your product isn't pure snake oil. Especially if you say things like machine learning, because there are a wide range of products that have a lot of buzzwords in them, but they don't really mean anything. There's not like a tangible, understandable application of the technology.
Yeah.
And so we try and strike a bit of a careful balance there between going a little bit too deep and making sure that we accurately portray what our product does. One of the things that we found to be immensely helpful in really telling the story of what our product does and how it works is we put some time early on into building some Jupyter notebooks that show effectively in action how some of our heuristics work and how they run. And we found that was really helpful in explaining at a high level how we would do something like stop a typo squatted package from being used in production, or how we would identify a malicious package by looking at patterns in the source code itself. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it's interesting. So, one question that I've been asking a lot of the tech founders is more of a, I don't know, philosophical question, if you will. But, over the next 10 years, as because you're a very technical person, I'm sure you're tied into a lot of different technologies. What are you most excited for in the future of what's going on? Is it, things around blockchain, machine learning, even to automated driving or other unique technologies? What kind of has you excited for the, general future of we'll even say society?
Great question. There are so many things coming out right now. It's sort of hard to pick just one. Obviously across the board, there's a lot of advances in the machine learning world happening now that are very exciting. I'm maybe not as excited about things like advances on the blockchain side, because there are a fairly limited number of real world applications that I've seen that seem like things that I really really dig into. Not to say that there aren't some out there. I'm sure there certainly are.
Right.
But I think advances in quantum computing are pretty exciting. As that sort of rolls forward and starts becoming more available and more useful. Rack scale computing is also pretty exciting.
I haven't heard of rack scale computing. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure, absolutely. So the idea effectively is, instead of having a single system that has, the core components that a system would have, like, its memory modules and, CPUs and things of that nature, it's all sort of broken out into a much larger construct. So you can have many more resources, than you would with just a single box, or what can be confined to a single box. There are obviously some interesting scheduling and resourcing issues associated with that, because the distance between components is much greater, right?
Yeah, very cool.
Well, Aaron, can you, just for those that are tuning in that want to learn more about you and Phylum, you want to tell them where they can check you out?
Sure, absolutely. So, our website and blog are sort of a good first pass, phylum.io. And we also have, some of the heuristics that we've already built listed in our documents there. So we're not quite open for general use just yet, but certainly we'd love to hear from anyone who's interested in sort of being an early design partner / early adopter.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
That's awesome.
Awesome. Yeah, we really appreciate you taking the time to talk about, not only your technology, but where the space is with software security and some of these other big challenges that I think almost all organizations are facing, and they may know it or not.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you, Aaron. Have a great day, and thanks for everyone for tuning in. We'll see you again next week. Take care, everybody.